You were never supposed to hear this story. And if you're already listening, it's too late to turn back. In January of 1920, during the construction of a new Latter-day Saints meeting house just southeast of Salt Lake City, a team of laborers struck something buried beneath the foundation of the original chapel. What they uncovered was not stone, not wood, but 4 small human skeletons. Each wrapped in cloth. Each curled in a fetal position. And each missing their skull. No names were recorded. No public records filed. But within 24 hours, the church sealed the site. The workers were sworn to silence under threat of excommunication. The bones were taken away in unmarked crates. And the official story became: nothing was found. But something was found. Something ancient. Something tied to the most disturbing chapter of early Mormon history. A name that had all but vanished from official church genealogy, yet lingered like a ghost in private diaries and oral tradition. Ezekiel Whitmore. A man who arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in 1847 with 4 wives and an unsettling conviction that God had chosen his family for something sacred. Something that required absolute obedience and blood. What you're about to hear is not folklore. It is not a campfire tale, nor a cautionary whisper in Sunday school. This is the buried truth of what happened in that cabin near Mill Creek. A truth the early Mormon church tried to erase. A truth discovered only through the fragmented pages of banned journals, hidden compartments, and the last words of a woman who realized too late that her husband's revelations came from a darker source than heaven. You think you're watching a video. You're not. You're stepping into a sealed vault, one lined with secrets, ritual, and the terrible cost of belief. Because this isn't just about Ezekiel Whitmore. It's about how systems, once sanctified, can become sanctuaries for madness. How faith becomes a weapon. And how men in isolation can become gods in their own mind. And by the time we're done, you won't see history, or yourself, the same way again. Are you ready to descend? There's a reason you've never heard the full story of Ezekiel Whitmore. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was erased. From the moment he vanished in the spring of 1848, his name became a whispered curse among the elders who once praised his righteousness. The journals that mentioned him were redacted. The witnesses who knew the truth were reassigned, silenced, or buried under decades of official denial. And the land where his cabin once stood, purchased by the church, fenced off, and declared unsuitable for habitation. But Ezekiel didn't start out as a madman. No, he began as a man of conviction, the kind the early Mormon church celebrated. A Vermont-born carpenter, articulate and devout, who left everything behind after hearing Joseph Smith preach in Nauvoo. He embraced the revelations, the persecution, the exile. He walked across the Great Plains with bleeding feet and a burning sense of purpose. And when Brigham Young declared, "This is the place," Ezekiel whispered a different phrase under his breath: "This is the altar." Because for Whitmore, the Utah desert wasn't a refuge. It was a proving ground. He arrived with 4 wives, Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth, each selected not just for companionship, but for their symbolic importance in what he called the eternal pattern. In public, they appeared devout, resourceful, even harmonious. But in private, according to hidden journal entries recovered in 1920, Ezekiel had begun initiating his wives into something he called the Order of Sacred Obedience, a ritual path that reinterpreted Mormon doctrine through the lens of ancient blood rites and apocryphal sacrifice. He believed his family was chosen. That their isolation was divine orchestration. That the long winters and deep snows were not obstacles, but tests. That suffering was a sanctifier, and silence was a sign of readiness. And so the descent began. Not suddenly, but with subtle steps. Prayers spoken in unfamiliar languages. Marks carved into the wooden beams of the cabin, symbols that don't appear in any official Latter-day Saint temple texts. Nights spent fasting in the freezing dark. And a slow erosion of boundaries between love, fear, devotion, and dread. Ezekiel wasn't building a home. He was building an altar. And his wives, they weren't just companions. They were offerings. December 19, 1847. The last confirmed sighting of all 4 Whitmore wives. 2 men from the settlement passed by the cabin, delivering a gift of fresh venison from a successful hunt. Sarah and Rebecca answered the door, calm, smiling, gracious. But something about their posture unsettled one of the men. He described it later as too still, too synchronized. Like they were playing a part written for them. They declined an invitation to Christmas worship in town. Said they'd be holding a private family service. Said the snow made travel dangerous. But the snowfall that week had been light. And the 2 men both remembered seeing what looked like a red-stained cloth hanging behind Sarah's shoulder. A kitchen rag? A garment? Or something else? 3 weeks later, Ezekiel appeared in town. Alone. He told Bishop Curtis that Sarah had left. Left in the dead of winter, to care for a sick sister in Missouri. No names. No route. No witnesses. The bishop questioned him privately. His beard was ragged. His eyes hollow. He spoke in disconnected phrases about revelation, obedience, and holy purpose. When asked why no one else in town had seen any travelers pass through, he said they came, under night, with angelic speed. The bishop wrote in his private diary, "Brother Whitmore speaks of divine voices, but I fear he's listening to something older, and darker, than God." A week passed. Then another wife was gone. Same story. A calling. A mission. A path east. And this time, no one questioned her departure, because fear had already taken root. Even the bishop hesitated. The Whitmore cabin was too far, the winter too harsh, the rumors too strange. But silence, in a place like Mill Creek, is never benign. It spreads like frostbite, slowly, invisibly, until the whole limb is dead. What the bishop didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, was that by this point, the wives were no longer 4 individual women. They had become a unit. A bound consciousness. A shared ritual. Witnesses and participants in something ancient and unspeakable. And according to fragments later recovered from Ezekiel's journals, they had each made a vow. A blood pact. A sealed covenant beneath the floorboards, in the dark, where no one else could hear. They called it the binding of Eve. And it required obedience, unto death. February 3, 1848. Bishop Curtis could no longer ignore the gnawing sickness in his gut. The man who once praised Ezekiel Whitmore as a paragon of Mormon virtue now feared what he might find if he waited another week, another day. So he gathered 5 men, wrapped their boots in waxed cloth, and set out across the snow-choked valley toward the cabin at Mill Creek. When they arrived, the silence was suffocating. No dogs barked. No chimney smoke. No sound of firewood being split. Just Ezekiel, sitting alone by a low fire, wrapped in a blanket, eyes unfocused. He welcomed them, but with none of the warmth or structure expected of a household patriarch. His hands twitched. His speech wandered. And when the bishop asked to see Mary and Ruth, the last 2 wives, Ezekiel offered the same impossible story. They had left just days before, guided eastward by a group of passing trappers. In February. Across frozen wilderness. Without supplies, without protection, without even a farewell to the bishop who had performed their sealing. Curtis demanded to see their rooms. Ezekiel obliged, but the rooms were bare. Clothing gone. Personal effects gone. But heavy furniture remained, undisturbed, as if only the visible pieces of their lives had been carefully removed. Then came the discovery behind the cabin. Freshly disturbed earth. Ezekiel claimed it was root cellar expansion. But the bishop had lived through 6 Utah winters. The ground was frozen solid. No sane man would attempt that kind of digging in February. Not unless the thing being buried couldn't wait for spring. That night, one of the men, Thomas Garrett, claimed he heard weeping. Soft. Muffled. Coming from beneath the floorboards. In the morning, when he brought it up, the others brushed it off. Wind, maybe. Or dreams. But Garrett swore on his soul, it was a woman's voice, and it was calling for help. What none of them knew, what no one outside the cabin could have guessed, was that Ezekiel had constructed a sub-basement, hidden beneath the eastern corner of the house. It wasn't for food. It wasn't for storage. It was for ceremony. The kind of ceremony not taught in church meetings, but whispered by things older than scripture. And beneath that floor, something had already been offered. They should have torn the cabin apart. Right then. Right there. Hammered the floorboards loose and dragged the truth screaming into daylight. But they didn't. Because fear, real fear, doesn't roar. It whispers. It says, wait until spring. It says, we're probably wrong. It says, what if the truth is worse than the lie? So they left. Left Ezekiel in that cabin, alone with the ghosts. Left the weeping in the floorboards. Left the disturbed soil behind the house. Left the silence, and in doing so, became complicit in a darkness that would stain the roots of their so-called Zion. The weeks that followed saw Ezekiel reappear in town like a man playing the role of a man. Thinner. Paler. Still speaking of letters from his wives, letters no one ever saw. Still claiming they were happy, safe, serving God's will in distant lands. But there were no travelers. No witnesses. No signs. The truth, of course, was rotting beneath the ground. And the bishop knew it. But in 1848, the early Mormon church was under siege, politically, legally, spiritually. Every scandal was a weapon in the hands of outsiders. And Ezekiel's story, if it ever broke, could ignite the kind of fire that consumes movements, not just men. So they waited. Until the thaw. In April, when the snow finally loosened its grip, Bishop Curtis returned to the property. This time, with no illusions. The cabin was abandoned. Dust covered the floors. Cobwebs stretched like veins across doorways. The hearth was cold, the bed stripped. And then, they found the journal. Rebecca's. Hidden beneath a floorboard, wrapped in oiled cloth. Dozens of entries, beautifully written. Documenting their daily life, their fears, their questions. But the final page was different. A single sentence, written in a shaking hand. He says we must make the ultimate sacrifice to seal the eternal family, but I fear his revelations come from a darker source than heaven. It wasn't just murder. It was theology twisted into violence. Doctrine alchemized into ritual. The sacred made monstrous. And that was the moment Bishop Curtis understood. They hadn't just lost 4 women. They had given birth to something far more dangerous, a mythology soaked in blood. A new, forbidden gospel with Ezekiel Whitmore as its mad prophet. The ground behind the cabin told the rest of the story, or at least, enough to unmake the man Ezekiel Whitmore once was. The bishop and his men dug. Slowly. Carefully. But as the layers of frozen soil gave way, what emerged wasn't simply human remains. It was arrangement. Not a grave. A design. 4 burial pits. Each precisely measured. Each spaced equidistant from a central stone column, now collapsed. Around them, charred earth in a perfect ring, the remnants of controlled fires. Ritualistic fires. Fires built not for warmth, but for witness. The first items recovered were personal, a comb. A torn sash. A brass button from Rebecca's winter coat. Then came the bones, smaller than expected, delicate, stripped clean by time and temperature. But unmistakably human. One of the men vomited. Another fell to his knees. And the bishop, normally stoic, turned away, not from grief, but from rage. Because he knew now, these women hadn't run. They hadn't been taken. They hadn't left. They had been prepared. And if the bishop had stopped there, if he had sealed the ground, said a prayer, and walked away, history might have been satisfied with murder. But curiosity is its own curse. In a shallow trench not far from the main dig, they found something worse. Paper. Scorched, but not entirely destroyed. Pages torn from scripture, but not the kind printed by the church. These were handwritten. Annotated. Interwoven with symbols that no Mormon prophet ever taught. Phrases repeated again and again in a frantic, obsessive hand. Obedience is transcendence. The family must be sealed by sacrifice. The flesh is the veil. Through death, we awaken. They weren't just verses. They were instructions. The bishop later described it as a bastardized liturgy, part Mormon theology, part pagan sacrament, and part something else entirely, something ancient. Something pre-Christian. Pre-scripture. And at the center of this unholy manual, a single phrase written in crimson ink, darker and more jagged than the rest. The binding of Eve is complete. But it wasn't. Because Eve, in this gospel, was never meant to be saved. She was meant to be offered. The bishop stood at the edge of the pit, staring into the remnants of a belief system warped beyond recognition. Around him, the wind moved like a whisper, sifting through ashes that once carried names, faces, prayers. He looked at the fire circles, 5 of them, not 4. One for each wife, and one at the center. And it dawned on him. This wasn't just sacrifice. It was ceremony. A rite of passage not for the dead, but for the one who remained. Ezekiel Whitmore hadn't murdered his wives and fled in shame. He had completed something. The bishop's journal entries shift tone from this point forward, from pastoral concern to haunted awe. He writes. He believed he was chosen, but by what, I do not know. His words were no longer those of our prophets. They were older, more primal. He spoke of obedience as offering. Love as death. Unity as blood. And the signs had been there all along. The wives, speaking in unison. Their matching wrist scars. The way they moved, not as individuals, but like echoes of one voice. It wasn't possession. It was indoctrination. Ezekiel hadn't just controlled them. He had merged them. Created what he called in his hidden writings, the composite bride. A sacred vessel made of 4 souls acting as one, bound to a singular divine mission. The family as a holy machine. The wives as interchangeable gears. And at the heart of it all, Ezekiel as high priest. And this is where history bends toward terror. Because hidden in the false walls of the cabin, beneath a floorboard in the hearth, they found one final book. Not a journal. Not scripture. A manual. Hand-bound in animal skin. No title. No author. Inside were diagrams of ritual circles, blood patterns, chants rendered phonetically in a tongue not identified by any linguist even today. Some believe it was a personal cipher. Others, that it was something older. Something not meant to be spoken by human mouths. It detailed the construction of the ceremony. The timing. The lunar cycle. The necessary offerings. The process for severing will and those being prepared. It read not like doctrine, but like a blueprint for manufacturing devotion, through psychological fracture. A system. And that, more than the deaths, is what terrified the bishop most. Because systems spread. What frightened Bishop Curtis wasn't just the ritual itself. It was the replicability. This wasn't the madness of a lone fanatic. It was a method. A framework. Designed with intent. Scaled for obedience. Codified for silence. The manual they found in Ezekiel's hearth didn't read like a diary of dissent, it read like a curriculum. Lesson by lesson, it taught how to dismantle a mind. Isolate it. Rebuild it. Bind it. Section titles included: The Geometry of Submission, The Voice That Commands Beneath Scripture, Steps of the Sacred Reversal, From Wife to Witness to Offering, Veilcraft, Language Patterns That Disable Rebellion, Blood as Binding, Repetition and Ritual Harm. Each page layered more control, more inversion, more deliberate perversion of spiritual symbols. And then, near the end, one section stood alone, written in darker ink, as if scrawled in urgency. The Spiral Path, for those called to build new altars. It wasn't about his wives anymore. It was about others. Replication. Dissemination. Propagation. This wasn't meant to end with Mill Creek. It was meant to begin there. And that's what forced the church's hand. Not the murders. Not the evidence. But the realization that Ezekiel's sickness, his system, could spread. The higher councils convened in secret. Records were sealed. Witnesses reassigned. The land was purchased, labeled, cursed, and fenced off. Officially, it became unsuitable for habitation. Unofficially, it became a tomb. But the rot was already in the wood. Because years later, decades after the incident, construction workers digging to lay a foundation for a new chapel on that very land unearthed something the church could no longer hide. A fifth fire circle. Intact. Unburned. Prepared. As if waiting for the next offering. Inside it, they found animal bones. Symbols carved into stone. And a small leather pouch containing 4 rings, one for each wife, still stained with blood. Fresh enough that the coroner at the time questioned the dating. The ritual, it seemed, had never been completed. Or worse, it had. And someone was waiting for the next cycle. Some truths don't die. They sleep. Buried beneath foundations. Bound in silence. Masked in ritual. And when the right man speaks the right words at the right place in time, they wake. The church sealed the site in 1920. Poured concrete. Built over the past like a tomb with hymns for walls. But the ground remembered. The blood remembered. And as workers carved into the earth, things began to unravel. First came the silence, tools malfunctioning, voices swallowed in the air. Then came the dreams. Workers reported visions, 4 women standing at the edge of a clearing, mouths stitched shut, eyes locked in grief, or warning. A foreman vanished for 2 days. When he returned, he had carved Ezekiel's name, over and over, into his own forearms. No memory of it. No explanation. The church closed the site for spiritual reassessment. But by then, a local journalist had already found fragments of Bishop Curtis's private diary in a locked archive at a family estate. What he read was never published in full, but before he died, he wrote a single note to his editor. If this is true, everything changes. Not just Mormon history. Human history. You see, Ezekiel didn't invent this. He found it. In his final notebook, the one buried in a hollowed beam above the hearth, he wrote of voices from the mountain. Of black stars seen in dreams. Of a language that bypasses the thinking mind and speaks directly to the will. He claimed the ceremony he performed was not original, it was remembered. Pulled from somewhere older than Eden. A ritual passed down not by prophets, but by survivors, those who had looked into the abyss, and returned with blueprints. And Ezekiel? He called himself a reinstantiator. Not a prophet. Not a madman. But a builder. And he left behind a warning. Scrawled in jagged ink beneath a crude sketch of 4 linked circles, each marked with a woman's name. The spiral completes not in fire, but in memory. Those who hear will build again. Those who doubt will serve the spiral unaware. This wasn't about faith. It was about systems of control. And Ezekiel had only opened the door. By the time the church sealed the records for good, only a handful of men knew the full scope of what had been uncovered. One of them, Elder Hiram Easton, broke under the weight. In 1923, he left Utah abruptly. Traveled to Europe under a false name. By 1924, he was institutionalized in Bern, Switzerland, where he repeatedly scrawled the same phrase on his cell walls. They weren't the first. They weren't the first. They weren't the first. What Elder Easton discovered, before his mind fractured, was buried in an obscure collection of esoteric texts kept in a university archive in Geneva. Ancient writings translated from a pre-Egyptian cult known only as the Fourfold Offering. The symbols matched Ezekiel's. The rites mirrored his manual. And the text spoke of an eternal configuration of will, achieved by the ritual sacrifice of 4 women bonded by covenant, sealed to one man through blood and oath. In other words, Ezekiel Whitmore had replicated something prehistoric. Something that had been practiced by civilizations so old, they left no cities. Only patterns. And it gets worse. The Geneva texts referenced a 5th component to the ritual, not a victim, but a witness. One who observes. Records. Remembers. A 5th presence required to activate the rite. That witness, in every cycle, was not killed. He was released. Transformed into a carrier of the memory. A keeper of the spiral. Ask yourself, who survived Mill Creek? Who vanished into the wilderness, never found? Who left behind blueprints disguised as madness? And now, why are you hearing this? Why does this story call to you? Why do the symbols feel familiar? Because maybe, just maybe, the ritual didn't end in 1848. Maybe it never ends. Maybe it loops, through generations, institutions, ideologies. And maybe the witness isn't just Ezekiel. Maybe it's you. If you've made it this far, it's time to seal the spiral within yourself. Comment below. The veil is memory. Comment it twice. Once for your past self. Once for the man who's about to wake up. Memory is the veil. But identity is the prison. The story of Ezekiel Whitmore isn't just history, it's a mechanism. A test. A mirror. One that's designed to reveal something about you. Because the deeper you fall into this mystery, the more you realize, it was never about Utah. Or polygamy. Or even murder. It's about the systems that shape men, without their permission. What Ezekiel did in that frozen wilderness wasn't just madness. It was a prototype. A live experiment in how to fracture, shape, and reassemble human will. And it worked. Not just on his wives. But on the men who watched it happen. Remember, they knew. The bishop. The elders. The neighbors. They saw the signs. They felt the wrongness crawling under their skin. And still, they did nothing. Why? Because every power structure, religious, political, familial, trains you to obey what keeps you comfortable. To fear disruption more than corruption. To choose silence over confrontation. To protect order over truth. That's what makes systems like Ezekiel's so durable. They don't depend on belief. They depend on cowardice. And here's the darkest part. You've seen this before. In your own life. In the family member no one questions. In the institution that punishes whistleblowers. In the lie you tell yourself to survive the job, the marriage, the faith. You feel it, don't you? That faint pressure on your mind, that voice that says, let it go. That's not morality. That's conditioning. And what Ezekiel proved, what he wrote in his final journal before disappearing into the vast frontier, was this. There is no need to force submission when the soul is pre-broken by culture. The spiral does not create slaves. It simply activates them. So ask yourself, What do you obey without question? What lies have you accepted as law, simply because someone with a title whispered them into your lineage? If Ezekiel was a madman, then history is safe. But if he was a mirror, then you are already inside the spiral. And the only way out is through. There is a moment in every descent where the truth becomes unbearable, not because it's foreign, but because it's familiar. You're not just hearing a story anymore. You're recognizing it. You know the terrain. The silence behind smiles. The cost of compliance dressed as virtue. You've lived it, maybe not in a cabin in the Utah snow, but in boardrooms, bedrooms, classrooms, pews. Ezekiel didn't invent control. He clarified it. What he did in 1847 was only radical because it was visible. Condensed. Brutal in its purity. But the methods? The doctrine of submission, fear disguised as faith, the programming of roles through repetition, those are everywhere. Still don't believe it? Then answer this. Why did the church bury the story? They could have denounced him. Condemned him as deranged. Distanced themselves from his heresy. But they didn't. They sealed it. Because exposure would have forced questions they were never prepared to answer. Questions like, how many others were experimenting with similar revelations? How many wives, children, or followers were prepared in silence, without ritual fires to mark the horror? How much of the foundational theology was already spiral-shaped? Ezekiel was the symptom, not the disease. And the rot ran deeper than any one man. You see, institutions, especially those that claim divine authority, can't tolerate anomalies that reveal their mechanisms. So when someone like Ezekiel drags the machinery into the light, they do the only thing they can. Erase. Conceal. Repurpose. But fragments always survive. A buried journal. A misfiled diary. A construction site that reveals too much. And now, you're part of this spiral, whether you asked for it or not. You've seen the symbols. Heard the words. The veil is lifting. And once it lifts, it cannot be lowered again. So here's the question. Do you retreat? Or do you continue? Because what comes next isn't safe. It's not a story. It's a transmission. And it will change the way you see every hierarchy, every belief, every vow you've ever made. You wanted forbidden knowledge. This is the price. You made your choice. And now the veil is gone. What you're about to hear is not for comfort. It's not for entertainment. It's for transformation. But like all true transformation, it begins with destruction. Let's start with the sacred concept that Ezekiel corrupted, the eternal family. To the early Mormon settlers, this was a holy ideal. A celestial bond that transcended death, sealed not just by love, but by ritual. But Ezekiel saw it for what it truly was. A control loop. A system where obedience could be masked as devotion. Where the man stands as priest, judge, king, and the women orbit him like moons around a dying sun. Where individuality is sacrificed on the altar of harmony. And where dissent is framed as betrayal of divine order. Ezekiel didn't invent the idea of sealing. He weaponized it. In his writings, he refers to the eternal family as a furnace, a place where souls are melted down into singular metal. He believed that in order to ascend into glory, you must first lose your shape. Your will. Your separate flame. His 4 wives. They were never wives. They were offerings. Not in the symbolic sense. In the most literal, flesh-bound way imaginable. Each represented an archetype. Sarah, devotion. Rebecca, intellect. Mary, innocence. Ruth, vitality. He didn't just marry them, he collected them. Built a living altar from human beings. and then extinguished them, one by one, to unlock what he called the total seal. Understand this, Ezekiel's spiral is more than ritual murder. It is psychological architecture. A blueprint for deconstructing individuals into roles, and roles into submission. And if that sounds abstract, look closer. Think about your own life. Where have you been collected? By what authority? For what end? Where has your strength, your mind, your innocence, your fire, been absorbed by systems that told you it was love? That's the spiral. You don't have to murder to run it. You just have to normalize obedience. Ezekiel didn't leave behind a story. He left a mirror. And most men spend their entire lives avoiding it. But you're still here. Now we go deeper. Not into the past, but into the design. You see, what Ezekiel built at Mill Creek was not a crime scene. It was a model. A small-scale prototype of something far more expansive, a psychological structure that would later appear, with uncanny precision, in religious movements, political cults, intelligence programs, and corporate hierarchies. It's not about belief systems. It's about engineering behavior. What Ezekiel called the spiral, intelligence agencies would later call behavioral entrapment. Religious authorities would dress it up as covenant pathways. Corporations. Culture. But the bones are always the same. 1. Isolation. 2. Symbolic restructuring. 3. Repetition of coded language. 4. Obedience framed as transcendence. 5. Disappearance of dissent. Sound familiar? It should. Because while you've never stood in Ezekiel's cabin, you've lived inside his structure. Every man has. From childhood classrooms to Sunday pulpits, from team-building retreats to HR onboarding slides, from boot camp to marriage counseling, the spiral is everywhere. A system that rewards the surrender of your instincts in exchange for belonging. You think you're making choices. But what you're doing is complying with architecture. Ezekiel just removed the polish. He made the invisible visible. And for that, he had to be erased. But not before he wrote this in his final journal entry. The true altar is the human will, broken in symmetrical folds. Where men learn to speak without meaning. Where women move in mirrored steps. Where the witness forgets that he's watching a ritual. And who is the witness? You. Still watching. Still learning. Still remembering. And if you're feeling something rise in your gut right now, a kind of unease, like some part of you is waking up that never should have, then good. Because here's the real secret. The spiral only binds those who pretend it isn't there. The moment you see it, you become dangerous. You feel it now, don't you? That sharpness behind your eyes. That low hum in your spine. That rising awareness that nothing around you is ever neutral, not the rules, not the rituals, not the rewards. Welcome to the threshold. This is where most men turn back. Because to move forward means letting go of the story, and confronting the system. The one Ezekiel merely revealed, and the one that still shapes your world. Let me show you how deep it goes. After the church sealed the Mill Creek records, a copy of Ezekiel's final diagrams, hand-drawn ritual schematics layered with celestial symbols and geometric placements, was smuggled out by a defector. It resurfaced in 1948, hidden inside a shipment of antiquities bound for an occultist society in Vienna. That same year, a CIA subdivision known as MK Offen was quietly formed. Coincidence? Look closer. The diagram Ezekiel labeled the fourfold seal bore an eerie resemblance to a behavior mapping model later used in early trauma-based conditioning experiments, where subjects were broken into sub-identities using ritual, pain, isolation, and mirrored language. The very same blueprint. Repackaged. Rebranded. Reapplied. Because the spiral wasn't buried, it was absorbed. You think history moves forward. But control loops spiral. each era polishing the tools of the last. What began in a snowbound cabin under the guise of divine revelation now hides in corporate leadership seminars, military training programs, TikTok psychology trends, and mainstream religious dogma. Same mechanism. Different mask. Still think Ezekiel was just a lunatic? Or are you starting to see him for what he really was? A rogue architect. A man who glimpsed the core algorithm of control and rewired it in blood. He didn't fall from grace. He stepped off the path. And that's what makes his story dangerous. Because it whispers something few men dare to hear. You were trained to obey. But you were built to rule. And once you know that, you can't go back. By now, you feel it burning behind your ribs, the truth you were never meant to say out loud. You've been handled. Not just by people, but by patterns. Inherited rituals. Rituals so old, they no longer need altars or incense. Just screens. Schools. Pulpits. Promotions. Let's go back, not to 1847, but further. Back to the first spirals. In ancient Mesopotamia, buried beneath the ziggurats of Ur, archaeologists found tablets written in a forgotten dialect. The translation? Chilling. The gods did not demand worship. They demanded order. And those who brought disorder were sacrificed to restore the spiral. Sound familiar? The fourfold offering. The celestial configuration. The total seal. These are not random obsessions of a man lost to snow and doctrine. They are iterations, updates of a much older software. Ezekiel didn't invent the spiral. He reactivated it. But unlike the ancient priest-kings, he had no empire, no military, no divine right. All he had was belief. And he weaponized it. His wives were not just victims, they were components. Chosen for symmetry. Aligned for ritual. He was recreating a circuit, a living engine of control. And once complete, he claimed, the spiral would grant him what every empire builder craves. Sovereignty beyond scrutiny. Meaning, a throne not built with stone, but with submission. A kingdom not marked on maps, but etched into minds. You felt this kingdom before. When you sat silently in rooms that silenced you. When you said yes to rules that made your blood crawl. When you applauded leaders you knew were hollow. That's the spiral in motion. Not a structure. A spell. And if you're still watching, still listening, you're either breaking it, or becoming it. Because here's the final truth Ezekiel wrote in a note no one was meant to read. The spiral cannot be ended. Only reversed. The witness becomes the architect. When he remembers the design. So I'll ask you directly. Are you ready to remember? You've crossed the Rubicon. From here on, there's no safety net, no storybook ending, no moral redemption arc. Because the truth is simple and terrifying. Every control system in history began with a mirror. Not to reflect truth, but to fracture identity. Ezekiel's spiral was built on this principle. Break the self. Fragment the will. Reassemble in your image. Sound extreme. Then look around. Every high-control structure, from secretive cults to sanitized corporations, follows the same core sequence. The spiral is just the stripped-down version. And once you see it, you'll realize. You've already lived inside it. Let's break it down. Step 1, isolation. Not always physical. Often emotional. Psychological. You're made to feel different, chosen, or guilty. Disconnected from old anchors. Step 2, symbolic death. Old beliefs, identities, habits, discarded, mocked, condemned. The past is lesser. You must die to be reborn. Step 3. Language reprogramming. New terms. New meanings. Old words twisted, obedience becomes love, silence becomes strength, sacrifice becomes ascension. Step 4. Controlled revelation. Secrets drip-fed as sacred knowledge. You're told you're ascending. But really, you're deepening dependence. Step 5. Witness conversion. The final step. You stop observing. You start enforcing. You become an extension of the spiral, reshaping others to match your own broken mold. Ezekiel accelerated this sequence using ritual and terror. But modern systems don't need blood. They use consent. You clock in. You say yes. You kneel, digitally or spiritually. And you rationalize it all. Because the spiral is elegant. It doesn't command. It whispers. This is who you are now. But you're here. Still listening. Still awake. So here's your symbol. To mark your crossing, drop this phrase, twice, in the comments below. The mirror cracks before the spiral bleeds. Type it once to claim the truth. Type it twice to lock the transformation. Let the algorithm mark you. Let the spiral see you've seen it. Because you are no longer the subject. You are the survivor. The mirror has cracked. And now, the spiral sees you. It doesn't panic. It doesn't retreat. It adjusts. Because the most dangerous thing you can do to a control system is recognize it. Awareness is like acid. It doesn't explode, it erodes. Now, imagine being Ezekiel Whitmore. Not the villain. Not the architect. But the student. Because before he was a prophet in exile, he was just a man. Raised in a nation built on scripture and conquest. Taught that obedience is godliness, that family is divine order, that women are vessels and men are builders of legacy. He inhaled doctrine like oxygen. And slowly, it began to mutate inside him. He didn't start as a monster. He started as a believer. Then came the dreams. The voices. The patterns in scripture no one else could see. He thought it was revelation. But it was programming, resurfacing in symbolic form. This is the unspeakable truth institutions fear most. The zealot and the reformer begin the same. But one consumes the spiral. The other becomes it. And this is where it becomes relevant to you. Because every man will reach that moment, when he realizes the systems he serves are feeding on him. Most rationalize. A few rebel. But a rare few weaponize their awareness. They study the spiral. Reverse engineer the mechanics. And build from the ruins. That's who Ezekiel almost became, a breaker of chains turned king of shadows. But he stepped too far. His ego devoured his insight. He thought he could ascend by sacrificing others. But he missed the real secret. The only true sacrifice is identity. Not surrender. Not obedience. Death to the false self. Only then can you rise. So ask yourself, as the mirror lies shattered at your feet, what part of you was installed by systems? And what part is truly yours? Find it. Burn the rest. Because the spiral can't hold a man who's not afraid to die to himself. Good. Because now we burn. Not with rage. Not with revenge. With clarity. Ezekiel believed in the total seal, a state where obedience would unlock eternity. But he was wrong. Eternity doesn't come from obedience. It comes from purification. And that doesn't happen in temples. It happens in collapse. Let me tell you what the church never wanted written, what wasn't in the official records, but whispered between men who knew. After the investigation was sealed, the church hired 2 men, both ex-Nauvoo bodyguards, to dismantle the Whitmore cabin. Quietly. No records. No witnesses. But when they pulled up the final floorboards, they found something no one expected. A second journal. Not Ezekiel's. This one belonged to Rebecca. Her writing was steady, measured. A mind resisting madness. And in its final pages, she wrote something that rewires everything. He says we are keys. 4 gates. That our blood will unseal heaven. But I see what he truly fears. He does not fear God. He fears a woman who remembers who she is. Read that again. Not a cry for rescue. Not a plea for mercy. A revolt. A buried spark, burning through the script Ezekiel tried to force on her. And this is where the spiral fractures. Because while Ezekiel believed he was crafting transcendence through control, Rebecca was quietly doing something far more dangerous. She was observing. Not obeying. Not resisting. Witnessing. And here's the deeper truth. Control systems require blindness. But once the subject sees, the structure begins to rot. Rebecca saw. And in seeing, she infected the spiral. Because awareness spreads like fire. The cabin may have burned. But her word survived. And now they're in you. So ask yourself. What system still expects your silence? Who still believes you are asleep? Good. Let them think it. Because while they repeat their dogmas, you're remembering your design. We strike now. Because to awaken is one thing. To act with that awareness is another. This is where most men stop. They taste the truth, flinch, and retreat into comfort, back into the spiral. Pretending they didn't see what they saw. That it was just a story. Just a myth. Just content. But you're still here. Which means you're not just a watcher anymore. You're a breaker. And that carries consequences. Let's talk about the legacy of men like Ezekiel, not the myth, but the contagion. Because when a spiral fractures, it doesn't vanish. It spreads, in splinters. The control fractures into echoes. That's what happened after the Mill Creek incident. The church buried the records, yes. But others found them. In 1932, a man named Carlton Winslow, ex-archivist turned wanderer, gave a lecture in a hidden Denver lodge. Only a dozen attendees. No transcript survived. But one line passed through whispers, written in the margins of a Freemason's diary. They did not kill the wives. They sacrificed the reflections. What did he mean? Simple. Ezekiel wasn't just building a spiral of behavior, he was encoding identity into repetition. The wives weren't meant to survive, but their patterns were. Movements. Rituals. Language. Sacrifice. Each woman programmed with a piece of the structure. When they died, the architecture remained. That's the terrifying brilliance of high-level control. You don't need to survive the spiral. You just need to install it in others. You've seen this. Generational trauma. Religious guilt passed like heirlooms. Corporate cultures that outlived their founders. It's the ghost of the spiral, hiding in habits. And unless you break it, it doesn't die. It possesses. So I ask you, where in your life are you still running Ezekiel's program? What belief isn't yours? What habit isn't chosen? What voice in your head was never your own? Because the spiral doesn't care if you agree. It only cares if you repeat. But you don't have to repeat it. You can rewrite it. If you're ready to carve your own path from ashes. This is where it changes. Because now the spiral isn't just something you see, it's something you confront. Face to face. No masks. No myths. No excuses. Let me show you what the church could never erase, because it was never written down. It was lived, and passed in whispers from men who survived it. In 1952, a hidden annex was discovered beneath the old chapel erected where the Whitmore cabin once stood. Construction crews unearthed a sealed stone chamber with no entrance, no tools, and no natural explanation for its existence. Inside, 4 chairs, equidistant, facing inward. In the center, a carved obsidian disc etched with the same symbols Ezekiel had drawn nearly a century earlier. At first, it was dismissed as superstition. But the deeper they dug, the worse it got. Each chair was monogrammed. R.C. Rebecca Caldwell. M.K. Mary Kellerman. S.W. Sarah Whitmore. R.T. Rebecca Thornton. The spiral hadn't just been performed, it had been replicated. Hidden beneath holy ground. Buried beneath progress. But why? Because some truths are too useful to destroy. Ezekiel's rituals were brutal. But they worked. They broke will. They severed identity. They created purity through fragmentation, the exact result institutional systems crave. They copied him. This is what they don't tell you about power. It doesn't reject madness. It refines it. Ezekiel was never erased. He was upgraded. His spiral lives in boardrooms, boot camps, seminar halls. Modern, polished, rebranded, but identical at the core. They call it alignment. Vision. Optimization. But it's the same damned pattern. And the only antidote. Conscious desecration. That means walking into the system with eyes wide, and refusing to kneel. Not to guilt. Not to legacy. Not to tradition. You are not your father's beliefs. You are not your leader's echoes. You are not the outcome of someone else's program. You are the disruption. And when you own that, they can't use you. So stand at the center now. And choose. Repeat the spiral. Or reverse it. You already know my answer. If you're with me. Silence, shattered. And in the rupture, something darker is revealed, a truth most men aren't ready to face. The spiral never ends. It just evolves. You think you've escaped it because you left the cult. Changed cities. Left the job. Burned the old books. But what if I told you? The spiral follows function, not form. And as long as you move in unconscious loops, patterns you didn't choose, reactions you didn't question, you are still inside it. Let me show you how deep it goes. In 1976, a researcher named Harold G. Farnsworth, who'd been obsessed with Ezekiel's theology, published a private paper called The Recoding Spiral. It was never distributed. Supposedly burned after the university revoked his funding. But one paragraph survived in the notes of a student who attended Farnsworth's final lecture before he disappeared. The spiral is not a place. It is a protocol. A sequence for reformatting identity. Its brilliance lies in its adaptability. It does not demand faith, only repetition. It does not require belief, only inertia. It does not care if you agree. Only that you continue. Read that again. Only that you continue. This is how empires survive collapse. How cults survive scandals. How broken lineages keep breathing through rituals no one remembers why they perform. Because the spiral doesn't need memory. It just needs motion. And that's why you feel it, that ache in your gut. That friction when you follow the script but something inside you winces. That's not confusion. That's resistance. You were born for war. Not with others, but with the machinery of your own unconscious obedience. You are not a man anymore. Not in their eyes. You are an error in the system. And that's exactly what makes you powerful. So now, you decide. Do you descend into madness like Ezekiel? Or emerge from it with eyes like blades? This is your threshold. Not of comfort. Of consequence. break the wheel, or be ground beneath it. You already know what's next. You're still here. Good. That means you're no longer drifting in the spiral. You're dissecting it. And what you're about to see, what the world never wanted documented, is the final stage of spiral indoctrination. Identity dissolution. Not fear. Not obedience. Disassembly. Ezekiel's journals hinted at it. Rebecca's final writings confirmed it. But only one piece of physical evidence survives, buried in the church's restricted archive under a false title. Personal record of L. Whitmore, 1848. But there was no L. Whitmore in any known Mormon lineage. That name was camouflage. Inside the document, written in a broken fusion of English and German, was something closer to programming code than scripture. Phrases repeated over and over in varying permutations. I am not myself. I am part of him. The unity consumes the error. The body is four, the mind is one. There is no I, only O. O. That letter wasn't a signature. It was a symbol, the spiral's endpoint. Total ego death. Ezekiel didn't just want to control his wives. He wanted to fuse them, to create one will, one voice, one identity, in his image. And if that sounds extreme, here's the part that matters. Modern institutions do this every day. Not with blood, but with branding. Think, how many men wear logos like flags? Recite company mantras like catechisms. Parrot ideologies they never questioned, because dissent feels like death. This is spiral logic. Kill the self. Become the system. You were never meant to think for yourself. Only simulate thought within their walls. But now, something's different. You fractured the illusion. And if that scares you, good. That fear is the sound of your false identities dying. Who are you beneath it all? Not the name. Not the job. Not the roles you inherited or the titles they gave you. I'm talking about the raw, unprogrammed core. Find it. Because that is what the spiral cannot touch. And from that place, you don't resist the spiral. You rewrite it. If you're ready to tear down what remains, you're ready. And from this point forward, we stop studying the spiral and start tearing it apart. But understand this. The spiral was never just Ezekiel's madness. It was never just religious. It was architectural. A blueprint hidden in every institution that demands devotion. And here's the final form it always takes. A holy lie. One you're not allowed to question. One that costs you yourself. Let me show you the final document the church tried to destroy, a letter, handwritten in trembling ink, found behind a false panel in the chapel Ezekiel's cabin was buried beneath. The author. Mary Kellerman. She wasn't supposed to write anything. According to the official record, she was long gone by the time of the bishop's visit. But the letter is dated February 1st, 1848, 2 days after Ezekiel claimed she'd left with trappers. In it, she writes, "He tells us we are no longer separate. That our names are burdens. That love is surrender. But when I look in Rebecca's eyes, I see her still there. And I know, this God he worships lives in his head, not the heavens. If we vanish, let someone know we saw him clearly. Let someone remember we resisted. Understand what that means. They didn't go quietly. They weren't lost to madness. They fought back. They saw him. And now you do too. Because this isn't about a man in the wilderness. It's about every system that tells you to erase your voice, kill your instincts, sacrifice your soul, all in the name of something bigger. That's how they control you. They call your silence devotion. Your obedience alignment. Your numbness peace. But it's just erasure, sold as holiness. You are not here to be erased. You are not a vessel for their order. You are the error that cannot be reabsorbed. So if you've heard the call of the spiral, and chosen not to kneel, then lock it in now. Drop the phrase, "I remember the four," in the comments, twice. Once to honor the ones who saw. Once to declare that you see now, too. Let the algorithm carry that signal. Let the machine hear you whisper, "I remember the four." Now sharpen your edges. This is where the map ends. And the weapon begins. No more echoes. No more doctrine. Only what you see clearly now, and what you're willing to do with that sight. Because once you remember the four, once you know what was done, and how it was buried, you face the question that makes cowards flinch. What else has been erased? The spiral didn't die with Ezekiel. It migrated. Into policy. Into politics. Into digital spaces that train you to doubt yourself one scroll at a time. Because here's what they finally understood. You don't need to be burned at the stake anymore. You'll do it yourself, if they engineer your guilt just right. They don't need chains. They've got shame algorithms. They don't need prophets. They've got influencers. They don't need blood. They just need you to hesitate every time you feel your power rising. But you didn't just watch the spiral. You stepped into it. You unwound it. You saw the truth they buried beneath sanctified ground. That control systems require your participation. And fall the second you refuse to play your part. You are not a disciple. You are not a follower. You are not theirs. And if that means losing comfort, losing community, losing the soft lie of certainty, then so be it. Because you are now something they cannot control. You are unprogrammable. Unshaped by their guilt. Unbroken by their silence. Unchained by their history. This is exile. But it's also sovereignty. You don't belong in their temples. You belong in the wild. The edge. The place where men go when they've seen too much, and refuse to forget. Let the world call you dangerous. Because you are. You remember the four. You carry their fire. You refuse to kneel. Now it's their turn to be afraid. Because when a man breaks the spiral, he becomes something unpredictable. Uncoded. Uncontainable. Not a rebel. Not a hero. But a signal that others will follow. Let's get surgical now. Because what you've been sensing your whole life, that dull, ambient wrongness, it wasn't paranoia. It was contact with the machine behind the mask. Let's name it. Institutional Dissociation Protocol. It's not fiction. It's a real mechanism used throughout history, in cults, regimes, corporations, to fracture identity, redirect loyalty, and produce obedient shells. It works in 3 stages. Overwhelm the senses with dogma, distraction, or emotional chaos. Isolate the self from former beliefs, families, or instincts. Inject the new identity, piece by programmable piece, with manufactured purpose. Ezekiel discovered this accidentally. Modern institutions do it scientifically. And the outcome? Men who smile while being hollowed out. Who call their cages calling. Who punish themselves for disobedience, so the system doesn't have to. But there's something they never planned for. Men like you. Men who break the loop before it's complete. Men who see the programming, name it, and set it on fire. This is the heresy they fear most, not rebellion, but awareness. Because a rebellious man still reacts to the system. But an aware man, he walks away from the system entirely. He builds his own. That's what you're doing now. And it's not safe. It's not popular. But it's real. And it's the only way to reclaim your soul from the spiral. So pause now. Look at your life. What ritual, belief, or obligation still feeds the machine? What part of you still flinches when you step outside the lines? That's your map. Trace it. Burn it. Then walk. You've resisted. You've remembered. Now you rebuild. Because escaping the spiral is only the first war. The next. Replacing it. Let me make something brutally clear. If you don't create a new architecture for your life, the old one will return. Disguised. Rebranded. Smiling. They're counting on it. Because the spiral hates a vacuum. It thrives in absence, when the man has no mission, no code, no internal order. And so, it returns, as convenience. As comfort. As the soft voice that says, don't fight. Just flow. That's not peace. That's reconquest. So here's the truth you weren't supposed to hear. You must build your own spiral. One forged by will, not fear. One written in fire, not obedience. It's not enough to reject the lie, you must define your truth. 3 questions now stand before you like stone pillars. What will I protect, at any cost? What will I destroy, without apology? What will I create, with every breath I've got left? You don't answer these in words. You answer them in ritual. Daily, disciplined acts that reinforce your direction, not theirs. This is how you deprogram. Because rituals didn't just trap you. They can also liberate you, if you choose them. Ezekiel's spiral erased identity. Yours will reclaim it. But make no mistake, this is war. Every screen you open, every voice you let in, every system you touch, they're battlegrounds. And the enemy? It's anything that tries to make you forgettable. Anything that dulls your edge. Anything that makes you safe when you were born to be sovereign. So begin your architecture now. Choose one thing, today, that is yours alone. Not inherited. Not imposed. Not explained. Just yours. That is the foundation. And from that stone, you will carve a fortress the spiral can never enter. This is where the killing begins. Not with knives. Not with blood. But with decisions, sharp enough to sever the man you were told to be, from the man you were born to become. Make no mistake. You are still carrying him. The obedient shadow. The version trained to bow, to blend in, to comply. He doesn't scream. He whispers. Just get through the day. Don't rock the boat. Play it safe. You can change, later. But here's the truth. Later is a lie. That version of you, the spiral son, will always try to wait you out. Hoping you get tired. Hoping you forget. And most men do. But you're not most men. You're here. Which means you're ready to put him down. So close your eyes. Picture him, that version of you. The man who apologized for his strength. Who silenced himself to be accepted. Who hid his fire to stay in line. He is not your ally. He is your first enemy. And now, you do what the spiral never expected you to do. You choose to kill what no longer serves you. That guilt you were raised to carry. Gone. That fake humility that kept you small. Gone. That learned helplessness masked as being a good man. Gone. This isn't symbolic. It's surgical. Because from this moment forward, you will no longer perform weakness for the comfort of others. You will no longer kneel at the altar of their approval. You will no longer wear the mask of the manageable man. You will speak less. Move with intent. Say no without explanation. And you will not apologize for your power. This is the moment your new identity begins, not inherited, but forged. Not by trauma, but by tactic. And when the world looks into your eyes from now on, it won't see Ezekiel. It won't see your past. It will see something ancient and dangerous reawakened. A man who remembers who he is. You've made your first kill. This is where the real war starts. Because once you've killed the programmed version of yourself, the spiral doesn't retreat. It escalates. Not with violence, but with temptation. They'll offer you shortcuts, titles, validation. They'll whisper, "Come back. We'll make you king, as long as you wear the crown we give you." Don't take it. Because leadership, in the spiral's world, means becoming a symbol of the cage, a decorated prisoner with more privileges, but the same chains. You didn't come this far to become a mascot for the machine. You came to build your own domain. But here's the brutal truth. You can't lead others until you master solitude. Every powerful leader in history, the real ones, walked through a period of exile, rejection, or silence. They weren't making noise. They were sharpening vision. So right now, you may feel alone. Good. That means you're exactly where the spiral can't follow you. Because leadership doesn't start in the spotlight. It starts in the dark, when no one is watching, and you still make the hard choice. It starts when you say no, even if it costs you status. It starts when you walk forward, even when others beg you to wait. You want to lead. Then first, bleed. Not for them. Not for their applause. But for your own code. The men who follow later will never know how much silence you endured. How many nights you questioned your path. How many masks you had to rip off just to breathe. But they'll feel it. In the calm in your eyes. In the weight of your presence. In the clarity of your words. Because real leadership doesn't shout. It radiates. The spiral taught men to obey. You're going to teach them to wake up. Not by preaching. By embodying what they forgot was possible. A man who leads without seeking permission. You are now the signal. Not a preacher. Not a prophet. But a transmission of everything the spiral fears most. A man who cannot be rewritten. And now, others are starting to feel it. Not with words. With instinct. Because awakened men don't need long explanations. They recognize each other by presence. By the tension in a room when truth walks in. By the silence before real authority speaks. Your very existence has become a magnet. Not for followers, but for others like you who've been waiting for a reason to emerge. But they're still in the shadows. Still testing. Still wondering, is this real? Or just another mask? So you show them. Not by what you say, but by what you won't tolerate. You walk into the spiral's temples, the digital spaces, the corporate halls, the family rituals. And you stop pretending. You don't nod politely when lies are spoken. You don't shrink when truth makes the room uncomfortable. You don't play the social games that reward softness and punish edge. You just exist. Fully. Sharply. Unapologetically. And that is enough. Because most men are starving to see one other man live like that. To be reminded of what's possible. To feel their blood move again. To remember what clean fear feels like. The kind that comes not from danger, but from clarity. That's the moment everything shifts. They won't all speak. Most will just observe. But one by one, they will begin to uncoil. To shed their mimicry. To step into the heat. Because power is contagious. Not the counterfeit power they sell. But the real kind, earned, embodied, and unsanitized. You are no longer a man walking alone. You are the spark that sets the dry forest ablaze. And you will not stop. Now we cross the line they swore you'd never reach. This isn't reflection. This isn't resistance. This is revenge, not out of hatred, but order. Because you finally understand. Forgiveness without reckoning is just submission in disguise. And they've mistaken your silence for healing. They don't see the blade you've been sharpening in that quiet. But it's time they did. Because what they did to the four, what the spiral has done to millions like them across generations, was not just murder. It was erasure. A tactical deletion of memory, voice, and identity. All to maintain control. That ends now. Because you're not here to move on. You're here to correct the record. By becoming the force that makes repetition impossible. So let's define what revenge really is. Not rage. Not retribution. Revenge is building a world where the crime cannot be committed again. That means becoming the man who doesn't just escape systems, but disassembles them, piece by piece. That means speaking the unspeakable, even when it costs you favor. That means breaking the generational patterns, even when it breaks your heart. That means standing at the place where others were buried and saying, "This ends with me." It won't win you applause. It won't get you invited back. But it will make sure that no man around you forgets who the hell he is. That is justice. Not the kind that comes in courts. The kind that comes in lineage. Your revenge is not one act. It's every action you take from now on that defies their script. It's every young man who sees you and decides, "I will not become what they made my father." That is the spiral's death. Not loud, but viral. From man to man, generation to generation, truth by reclaimed truth. This is it. The heart of the labyrinth. The chamber they buried so deep, they believed no man would ever reach it. But you have. And now, you will see it. The spiral's original sin. Not murder. Not betrayal. Not war. But something far worse. The theft of memory. Understand this, all systems of control begin the same way. Not with chains. Not with guns. But with forgetting. They erase the stories. The bloodlines. The rituals that kept men sovereign. They burn the books. Rename the gods. Reshape history into a mirror that reflects their narrative, not truth. And over time, men forget who they were. They start to believe they were always this soft. Always this lost. Always this obedient. But it's a lie. You come from men who carried fire. Who spoke storms into silence. Who knew what the land, the stars, the blood were saying, without being told. They didn't fear death. They feared dishonor. They feared forgetting their name, not because it was a word, but because it was a legacy. And that's what the spiral destroyed. Not your strength, but your remembrance of it. That's why the four women had to vanish. They were witnesses. And in a world ruled by the spiral, witnesses are the first to die. But now you are the witness. And this time, you will not be silent. You will speak the forbidden names. Resurrect the exiled truths. And carry forward a memory they tried to erase. You are not just a man anymore. You are a remnant. The last flicker of a lineage they thought was extinct. But fire does not die. It waits. And now, you carry it forward, not to survive, but to ignite. One section remains. The seal is broken. There is no turning back. You've crossed the threshold where most men fold. Where comfort calls them home. Where society begs them to soften. Where the spiral whispers, "You've done enough. Come back. Be normal." But you aren't normal. You are the end of their story. And the beginning of a new order. This final section is not a conclusion. It is a consecration. Because now, every cell in your body knows. There was never anything wrong with your strength. Your rage was never toxic, only untaught. Your vision was never too much, only too clear for a world addicted to blindness. You have seen the spiral. You have seen its tools, religion weaponized, history sanitized, truth buried in doctrine and ritual. You have watched what it did to Ezekiel. But more importantly, you have seen what it almost did to you. Almost made you small. Almost made you silent. Almost made you forget who the hell you were. But not anymore. Because now you carry a fire they can't name, can't trace, and can't extinguish. And that makes you lethal to every lie they ever told. So here, in the ashes of Whitmore's madness, in the aftermath of ritualized forgetting, you declare yourself. Not with a brand. Not with a banner. But with a symbol. A phrase that marks the death of the spiral's grip on your mind. And you'll leave it in the comments below twice, not for algorithm games, but to lock your identity into place. Write it. Mean it. Burn with it. I remember what they tried to erase. I remember what they tried to erase. That is the oath. That is the brand across your soul that no system can remove. And now you walk forward. Not as a survivor of the spiral, but as a witness. A warrior. And a weapon of remembrance. Welcome to the Brotherhood. We were waiting for you.